Why did Jesus pick the most hated group in Israel to play the hero of his most famous parable? Ask most people about the Good Samaritan, and they picture a nice man who helps a stranger on the road. A pleasant little lesson about kindness, right? Wrong. Few people know the anger sitting behind this one word, Samaritan. Few people know the shock the story delivered to everyone listening in the crowd, or the fact this hero belonged to a group most Jewish people would cross the street to avoid. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who the Samaritans were, why Jews and Samaritans despised each other for centuries, and why Jesus chose this exact group to teach the biggest lesson on love in the whole Bible. This story comes from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Luke wrote his gospel for a mostly non-Jewish audience, somewhere between 60 and 90 AD, and he wanted readers outside Israel to understand who Jesus was and what his teaching meant for everyone, not only for the Jewish people. Luke was a doctor by training, and he gathered his account from eyewitnesses who walked with Jesus, which explains the careful detail packed into this parable. This scene sits in the middle of Jesus' public ministry, right after he sends out 72 followers to preach and heal, and right before he visits the home of Mary and Martha. A religious lawyer walks up and tries to test Jesus with a question about eternal life. Jesus asks him what the law says, and the man quotes the command to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus tells him he answered correctly, but the lawyer wants to justify himself, so he pushes further and asks one more question. Who counts as my neighbor? Jesus answers with a story instead of a lecture, and this story becomes the parable we now call the Good Samaritan. Before we reach the parable, you need the backstory the original crowd already knew by heart. Centuries earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. The Assyrians hauled off many Israelites to foreign lands and brought in foreign settlers to resettle the region. 2 Kings chapter 17 describes the result plainly. The new arrivals mixed with the Israelites who stayed behind, married into local families, and blended their own gods with worship of the God of Israel. 2 Kings 17:33 puts the outcome this way. They feared the Lord and served their own gods. Out of this mixing came a new group, the Samaritans, named after Samaria, the old capital city. Jewish people from the southern kingdom of Judah viewed Samaritans as impure outsiders with a corrupted faith. Not fully Jewish, and not fully foreign either, stuck in a category their neighbors refused to accept. Samaritans built their own temple on Mount Gerizim and worshipped there instead of Jerusalem, deepening the divide even further. Samaritans also kept their own version of the first 5 books of the Bible and rejected the rest of the Jewish scriptures, which gave both groups another reason to distrust each other's faith. Jewish writers of the period mocked Samaritans openly, and Samaritans returned the favor. The Gospel of John captures the tension in one blunt line. John 4:19 explains the woman at the well's shock at Jesus speaking to her, noting Jews want nothing to do with Samaritans. By the time Jesus walked the earth, the hatred between Jews and Samaritans ran so deep, most Jewish travelers walked extra miles simply to avoid Samaritan territory on their way between Galilee and Jerusalem. Here's a detail worth knowing before we move on. Samaritans never disappeared from history. A small community still lives near Mount Gerizim today, holding on to ancient customs and their own Passover sacrifice on the mountain every spring. This group carries a story stretching back well over 2,000 years, and this same group sat at the center of one of Jesus' boldest lessons. Now picture the crowd listening to Jesus speak. He tells them about a man traveling the dangerous road from Jerusalem down to Jericho, a steep, rocky path dropping over 3,000 feet in under 20 miles, famous across the region for robbers hiding among the rocks. Robbers attack this traveler, strip him of his clothes, beat him, and leave him half dead on the ground. A priest walks by first, someone trained in temple worship and expected to model godly behavior. Luke 10:31 says he sees the man and passes by on the other side. A Levite, a member of the priestly support tribe, comes next and does the exact same thing. Both men held respected religious positions. Both men chose to walk past a suffering stranger without lifting a finger. Then comes the twist. Nobody in the crowd expected. Luke 10:33, describes a Samaritan traveler who sees the wounded man and feels compassion for him. The opposite reaction Jewish listeners assumed a Samaritan would show toward one of their own. The Samaritan kneels down, bandages his wounds, and pours oil and wine over them, a common treatment in the ancient world used to clean and soothe injuries. He lifts the wounded man onto his own animal, walking alongside on foot, and carries him to the nearest inn. Luke 10:35 tells us the Samaritan hands the innkeeper 2 silver coins, enough to cover several nights of care, and promises to repay any extra cost on his way back through town. For the crowd gathered around Jesus, watching a Samaritan play the hero, while a priest and a Levite failed to help would have landed like a slap in the face. Jesus finishes the story by asking the lawyer a sharp question. Which of these 3 men acted as a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? Notice the question Jesus asks here. The lawyer originally asked, "Who counts as my neighbor?" expecting a list of approved people. Jesus flips the question entirely and asks who acted like a neighbor instead, shifting the focus from who qualifies for love to who chooses to give love. The lawyer refuses to even say the word Samaritan out loud. He answers instead, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus tells him, in the words of Luke 10:37, "Go and do thou likewise." The lesson lands hard because Jesus refuses to let the lawyer define neighbor as only people from his own group, his own background, or his own faith. Love, in Jesus' teaching, crosses every line people build to keep others out. Picture this in your own life today. Perhaps you have a coworker from a different political party, a neighbor from a different country, or a family member you disagree with on almost everything. Perhaps you scroll past someone online whose views make your blood boil, or you cross the street to skip an awkward conversation with a difficult relative. The Good Samaritan tells you love doesn't wait for someone to earn your respect first. Love doesn't check someone's background, their voting record, or their beliefs before deciding whether they deserve help. Love shows up for whoever needs help in front of you, no matter which side of the fence they stand on, and no matter how uncomfortable helping them feels in the moment. People often ask why the priest and the Levite walked past a dying man. Some teachers guess they worried about ritual purity laws, since touching a corpse made a priest unclean for temple service. This might explain part of their choice, but Jesus never gives us a reason in the passage. His point isn't why they failed. His point is failure. Plain and simple. Notice Jesus doesn't even bother naming their excuse, and this silence carries weight. Whatever kept them walking, a rule book, a busy schedule, plain fear, none of these excuses holds up against a dying man on the ground. Another common question people ask, did Samaritans count as a different religion or a different ethnic group? The honest answer, both got mixed together. Samaritans held to their own version of the first 5 books of the Bible, worshipped on their own mountain, and Jews viewed their claim to Israelite heritage with deep suspicion. The conflict ran through faith, family history, and national pride, all at once, which explains why this hatred ran deeper than a simple disagreement between neighboring towns. One more question worth answering. Did the Samaritan expect anything in return for his kindness? The passage never mentions a reward, a thank you, or even the wounded man waking up to say a word. The Samaritan pays out of his own pocket, walks away, and moves on with his journey. This detail matters because real love, according to Jesus, doesn't wait around for credit or recognition. Here's the main point of this whole passage. Jesus picked a Samaritan, the group Jewish people trusted least, to show what real love looks like in action. The story flips the question from who deserves my love to who will I choose to love. Remember the question we opened with? Why did Jesus choose the most hated group in Israel as his hero? Now you know. Jesus wanted to prove love has no borders, no exceptions, and no approved list of who qualifies. Before the next video, read Luke chapter 10 for yourself, verses 25 through 37, and picture the story fresh, without the church answer already loaded in your head. Ask yourself this question and drop your answer in the comments. Who in your life do you find hardest to treat as a neighbor? So the next time someone tells you the Good Samaritan is only a nice story about helping strangers, tell them the real story. A hated outsider became the hero, and the religious insiders became the warning. Love your neighbor was never about comfort. Love your neighbor was always about crossing the line you didn't want to cross. Subscribe for next week's lesson, where we break down another Bible passage people quote all the time but rarely understand.